We would like to acknowledge the indigenous lands and the cultures of New York. We honor the land as the Creator intended, and that we commit to keep it clean and support efforts to make it safe for all. We can show honor to the native keepers of the land by recognizing the value of their cultures and by learning the truth of their histories and how it provided the foundation for this country as we experience it today. Thank you for that very important acknowledgement. It's always important that we pay our respects. Now, we have our guest speaker, Dr. Dana E. Crawford. She is a clinical psychologist. She is a graduate of Howard, Temple, and Miami universities and has degrees in African American studies, education, psychology, and a certification in nursing. Dr. Crawford is also a scholar in residence at Columbia University's Zuckerman Institute. And finally, she is a developer of the Crawford Bias Reduction Theory and Training, aka CBRT. And she's the author of the R.A.C.E. race cards and serves as a cultural bias consultant with organizations across the nation. She resides in the heart of Harlem, New York City. Please give a warm welcome, digital claps, hearts, and hugs to my friend and yours, Dr. Dana E. Crawford. Glad to have you, Dana.
Thank you so much, Elijah, and thank you for that really generous and kind introduction. I am super excited. We have an amazing panel. It is wonderful to see so many friends, colleagues, friends I haven't met before, future friends and future colleagues. So we're going to dive right in because, as you all know, we are time impoverished and there's never enough time to do this work. So today we are diving in really specifically around having this important conversation that is meant to increase our racial awareness. We are all trying to survive right now the destruction and the devaluation of a particular set of knowledge. And when I say devaluing knowledge, what I'm talking about is epistemicide. If you've paid attention to the news, we know that currently there is an anti-DEI movement, a movement to eradicate conversations that center on seeing ourselves fully and our full identities related to not just race, but all aspects that make us so delightfully unique. And so in an attempt to fight epistemicide, the destruction of knowledge, we are going to engage in a very tender conversation today. More specifically, we're going to be focusing on using this card deck, racial awareness conversations for everyone to engage in community. A lot of us support diversity and we love diversity and we say that we want the spice of life, but you cannot understand, support, and benefit from diversity without diversity of ideas, beliefs, values, perspectives. And I dare say that I, in my lifetime, have never seen our country more divided, more siloed, more polarized. This is the time for us to hear each other, to see each other, to acknowledge, and even if we do not agree, we do need to be sure that we try to understand. And so engaging in these tender conversations, it requires discomfort. We have to be okay with the reality that our bodies, our minds, sometimes our heartbeat, our heart is going to beat faster, our breathing is going to change as we're having a tender conversation. We have been taught that many times we shouldn't even be discussing this. And the very notion that we're going to discuss our views and our cultural identities is a revolutionary act. And so I commend you on being in this space to decide that you are going to engage in the revolutionary act of community. It also helps foster understanding and empathy. When I can see myself in you, I can understand you a lot better. It helps us find solutions for many of the problems that we see repeating themselves over and over again. It models how to have these conversations. And this is particularly relevant when we think about our young people. And that's where we're centering the heart of this work is our youth. How could we possibly model for them acceptance and commitment without being able to do this work ourselves? And lastly, it helps us grow and be our best selves. So I developed these cards, racial awareness conversations for everyone, because after I would do workshops, people would often give really beautiful and generous feedback saying how transformative the work was, but they didn't always know where to go next. And yes, maybe they had an action plan. And for those of you who have done the intercultural development plan with me, you know, I'm like, work your plan, and you may be doing that, but we're still time impoverished. And a lot of that work may be in your own space, in your own head, in your own heart, in your own mind. What does it mean to connect and figure out the space between us? So I found that people did not know how to start important conversations. And when they started the conversation, they didn't actually know what to discuss. So I started with about 200 questions, and many of you at ECLC have the original race cards deck, and I appreciate you all for being a part of that prototype. And I started with all of these questions, and it took people hours to get through them, and it still takes a pretty long time to go through all of the cards, but I got it down to 48 exploratory questions that can be used for journal, but also as prompts for community, for connection in professional and personal spaces. I use these cards, yes, at work, but I also use them at cookouts and ask my family and my friends some of these questions. And I got to know people that I've known for my entire life in different ways. And I hope that that will be your experience as well. So I want to just read our pledge, because when we're having tender conversations, our goal is to maintain and create a boundary, a space where I can love and respect myself and you simultaneously. So this is the race card pledge, and I'm going to specifically read it out. And here's a little bit of music while I'm reading. I invite you to just hear these words and to hold them and to really think about the spirit of this pledge. Each and every one of us are making the commitment in this conversation today. I make the personal commitment to learn about, understanding, and support anti-racism. I assume everyone who is playing the race cards has the best intentions. I recognize that everyone is coming from different experiences and therefore different beliefs. I will monitor myself, my own affective, behavioral, cognitive, and physical reactions to playing the race cards. If I become too overwhelmed, I'll take a break or I'll discontinue the game to preserve the relationship with other participants and my optimal health. I will speak with respect and kindness, especially when engaging in a difficult conversation. And lastly, although I may disagree with ideas, I will not make personal attacks. So that's the pledge that each and every person who is engaging in this conversation is taking. These are our participants, and I'm going to stop sharing my slides here, and I'm going to read our first racial awareness conversation question, and that's going to be the way that each member introduces themselves. So the first question from the card deck is, which racial/cultural identities make up your heritage? And I invite my panelists to please come on camera now. And Rebecca, since you're the first panelist to come on camera, I'll start it off with you. Which racial and cultural identities make up your heritage?
I knew as soon as I saw I was the first one there, I was like, oh no, I think I just walked into being first. Well, I have to start with what I don't normally start with, which is that I have a sore throat and cough. So that's part of my identity today. So apologies if that comes across. Cultural and racial and ethnic identities. I will say I am a woman and identify strongly as a woman, as a female. I feel like that's a very important piece of my identity. I am white. I am a psychologist. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work with young kids and parents, and I'm a parent of two boys. And I know that gender is an incredibly complicated construct right now, but so far my boys, they're 8 and 10, and they are cis and hetero. And I have to say, kind of the idea of being a boy mom feels like it's part of my identity. I grew up in New York City, and that feels like a big part of my identity. I'm white and I'm Jewish, and Jewish is the part that makes my heart race a little, as I say right now. I saved it. Um, and it wouldn't have, a few months ago. And that's a really, really interesting place to be, and in some ways a privileged place to be, that I am 47 and it's only now that my heart races a little bit when I share a part of my identity that is invisible. And I know that's a privilege also. And I'm proud of my Jewish heritage, and also conflicted about what I know are perceptions of that right now. In particular, my grandparents, my dad's parents came over in 1938 from Germany. So thankfully, I don't know that they experienced the Holocaust in some of the most traumatic ways that there were. However, certainly their persecution is part of my history for sure. And anything else? I think I'll leave it there. I mean, I could talk for a very long time about my identity, but I want to hear about our other panelists. So thanks.
Hi, I'm Brian McQueen. I am a voice instructor and an opera singer. And my identity, my cultural identity, I would say is African American, Southern, queer, non binary. I do identify as femme. Uh, but yeah, I think mostly Black, African American, and Southern is a huge part of my identity as a human being. And being non binary is another major part of my identity, which is, speaking of invisible, often invisible for people because I'm read as a man, a very large man. I'm 6'4", and that's also part of my identity, whether I want it to be or not. And I'm also keenly aware of how my skin tone is also has a great deal to do with my identity, not only outside of my African American community, but even within, and how that reads, and how that impacts other people's ability to see tenderness in me, and the reality of my identity as a non-binary, and what their expectations may be, or what their requirements might be, and how they're capable or incapable of holding space for me in certain situations, and how I'm required or expected to move in the world. So that has definitely, that in combination with my height particularly and my sex, definitely has played a large part in how I navigate the world and how the world sees me. And also in my career as an artist, and also in what's capable of me as an educator. I'm constantly sort of engaging in spaces and people and adults, unfortunately, and trying to sort of navigate around their prejudices and what my identities might mean about interactions with their children or with children in general. So that's been something I've had to combat as well. But I would say mostly, I had to just narrow it down. I'm an artist, I'm African American, Southern, I'm queer, and non-binary.
My name is Krista Jankowski. I am a climate scientist and strategic planner, and so I combine those things to try and connect communities with resources to be more resilient in the face of climate change. I also have a background in education and have spent some time in the classroom. So along with sort of those professional or experience related identities of being a scientist or an educator and academic, I would say that my identity includes my whiteness, and it also includes my queerness. And so while I think similarly to Brian, while I'm often perceived, as a woman, and that impacts how I interact in the world, I do identify as queer and as sort of gender fluid. So that is part of my identity as well. I am a Midwesterner by birth, so shout out South Dakota for that. But for the last 13 years, I have been a very enthusiastic Louisianan. And so I do identify as, luckily, being able to be Southern now and Louisianan, not native, but local. So I'll take that where I can. And I think, I am a person who I think navigates the world with some respect to also being a person of size. I am a fat woman or fat person to most people who see me. And so that also impacts how people interact with me and the ways that I engage with folks in the world and how I'm perceived. So I think that does it for me for now.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris. I am a social worker and a therapist professionally. Uh, in terms of my cultural identity, I'm a Black male. Black man, that is probably the most salient identity that is with me wherever I go, which I'm very happy and proud of, despite all the negative talk that has historically existed around that. I am a Brooklyn boy, Brooklyn, New York, a very large part of my identity. Folks who have been in New York, live in New York, know people from New York, know that Brooklyn is a big thing. And so that is definitely a large part of my identity. It's just the Brooklyn in me. It comes out sometimes. Uh, Another part of my identity that is very strong and salient, I'm a husband. I've been married for 4 years. Next Wednesday, my wife and I got married on Juneteenth in 2020. So very, very excited about that. And I'm a new-ish father. My son will be 2 in July. And so still very early in terms of his gender and all the things that he does, but very excited to be a father as well. Uh, I'm also Puerto Rican. So, there's I guess, newness in the sense of Afro-Latinos and that verbiage being used in lexicon more recently, probably like 10, 15 years or so. Uh, but I never really identified with the Afro-Latino thing. I always went by being Black. And now I'm trying to get more in touch with my Puerto Rican heritage, how that has impacted me knowingly or unknowingly. So those are different aspects of my identity.
I really appreciate how, as I was listening to each and every one of you share aspects of your identity, it made me think about aspects of my identity that I might not have shared. And I'm wondering, as Rebecca started, if things became amplified as you got to listen to each person. And I think, I don't think, I know, I identify very strongly as a tall Black woman. But as you all were sharing, I thought about other aspects like my size and my height. I'm 6 feet tall, which is tall for a woman. But also parts of my identity that I don't have, right? That I don't necessarily lean into. And I hope as people engage with the race cards, hearing the language in which people are describing themselves helps you understand ways that you may understand others. And give you new ways of describing yourself, which I think is really beautiful. The next question that I have, and I invite panelists, I know that sometimes when we're in these spaces and we're having these conversations, it may feel like we need to go like, okay, jump on it. But there's a beauty in the space too. Like we're all invited to ponder. I think that's one of the greatest tools of racism, prejudice, and bias is that it makes you feel like you have to be quick and like have these witty responses like racism can wait a minute. It can wait for you to think. It can wait for you to pause. And so I just invite that space. This question comes from the awareness section. The race cards are divided up by awareness, investigation, and reduction. And this is the second awareness question for today. Describe a world event that has shaped a bias held by you and or your racial community. I'll read it again. Describe a world event that has shaped a bias held by you and your racial community.
I mean, I don't know if it's a world event, but it certainly was a national event. And I think the situation with George Floyd was, greatly impacted my community, and also, I guess, the global community. We had time to sit and rest in that and look at that and look at how Black people are treated, not only in America, but around the world. There is definitely, particularly in America and in New York in general, I think people were pretty shocked by it. I wasn't, but all racism towards Black people isn't just from white people. There is, colonialism did its thing, and there is a very clear anti-Blackness that is, it's palpable in this city, not only in America and around the world, but in this city, and it's perpetuated by other people of color, and so that was that rocked the world, I think, and it also highlighted some internalized racism within the Black community as well, that I think people had to reckon with. And for me, it highlighted the faults in sort of the advocacy work and the activist work that Black people ourselves were doing, because it was clear there was no real transference in certain aspects. So, like in Minnesota, where people left a Black Lives Matter march and then jumped a Black trans person right after the march, it was, that was very telling about how we're still dealing with our own, internalized racism, and how we can't, clearly see humanity across the board, even within our own community, if it's, if the sexuality or the gender of a person is different from ours, and how white supremacy has utilized religion to tear us apart and keep us, imprisoned by this, systemic racism. But yeah, I think particularly in New York, I think it was very, very telling, because there were conversations being had, and I live in a very Latin community. There were conversations being had surrounding Blackness and Black people, and police conversations that I found to be very, very, very disturbing, and surprising. Uh, so yeah, that was a big event, I think. I don't know if I would say it was a world event.
Jump in. Thank you, Ryan. Dana, just to clarify, the question talked about forming a bias, right? It obviously is an interpretation, but I think I heard that, right? What formed a bias? Yeah. So I'm going to be tender. I saw someone in the chat say that tender conversations is a better term than tough conversations. And I wouldn't have to be, because I could have some well-rehearsed answer to this. And my brain first went to October 7th, and I'm like, no, I'm going to really think about this. And what occurs to me is the rise of heroin use when I was growing up in New York City, which came to be known as the crack epidemic, and the way that it was portrayed in the media, and the way that I learned about it as a white girl growing up on the Upper West Side. How I learned what streets were safe for me to walk home from school alone on, and which ones were not. And all of the color, skin color that was associated with that, without being named. So having very politically liberal parents who were very concerned about my safety, who never said, don't walk on this street because there's Black people doing drugs, let alone talking about the history behind that and how that might have come to be. and instead just naming it on a surface level and letting my 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old brain run with that. And how many years it's taken me to unlearn that. And I think, Dana, the beauty of this approach generally is not that all of that's going to disappear, but that we're going to bring awareness to it. And so I might still notice when I'm walking down a street and I see a person of color. I mean, this was New York City culture in the 80s, and there was the stereotype of like, you cross the street, you know, Bernie Getz, all of that. And noticing that there is some wiring that still has that. There was I was looking through the deck of cards, and it says, what's one of the questions is like, what are the first 3 thoughts you have when someone with dark skin is walking toward you or something? And one of my thoughts is, if I were racist, I would cross the street. And I'm laughing just because we have to, I'm sharing this really vulnerable part of me, and I'm well aware that it's there. And I do everything I can to unlearn it, to talk about it, to give it space to breathe, because otherwise it's very, very dangerous. And so I'm owning that that was a bias that was created in me by my environment growing up, this world event, this epidemic, and how it reverberates, you know, decades later. And how conscious I am. I talked about being a mom, of not passing it on to my kids, and of naming things if there are differences in rates, let's say, of particular COVID, for example, in particular communities, what that's about, because kids fill in the blanks. And I did that. And I want my kids to have developmentally appropriate information, such that they fill in the blanks in less racist, prejudice, and biased ways.
I really appreciate, I mean, I always appreciate the tenderness and the thoughtfulness and the reflection in our conversations. And the area that I want to amplify specifically for this audience is that space that it wasn't explicitly named. And I think a lot of people, and when I say a lot of people, I mean specifically white people, believe themselves not to have been exposed to racism because it wasn't called that, right? It wasn't named this Black person. And even beyond race, I would even say related to class, when it's not named, sometimes that's a pathway for us to deny that it actually happened. And I think it makes it that much harder to unlearn those things because it was never explicitly named and explained. So then it's like, wait, what is this thing that's living inside of me that I don't agree with, but somehow it's here. So I really appreciate that share. Rebecca, thank you. Does anyone else want to respond to this question before I ask our next one? No? Okay. All right, so I'm going to move us to the investigation section. And my question is, what are 3 barriers you face when having honest conversations about race?
I'm not sure if I'm going to hit 3 of them, but I can definitely offer one. And I think one barrier that I definitely face is sort of policing myself and trying to make sure that if I'm having the conversation, I'm saying things in the right way, or really not necessarily being fully honest and showing up fully honest, maybe because I'm, worried about how what I say will be perceived. And so, and I think more than that, it's because I feel that if I were to say something that upset someone else, I would feel very guilty. I would feel very ashamed. I would feel upset with myself for having caused harm or for having, stumbled in some way. And so I think what I would pin that on would be, either when we get down to it is ego and is, my personal, like who I think of myself as. And if I'm having one of these tender conversations and I'm being very open, that vulnerability can be scary. And particularly when I value, the opportunity to have those conversations and that people are engaging with me in this way. And so I think one barrier I have is just getting over myself to have those conversations and to really, obviously, I don't want to harm other folks. And sometimes that in turn is more harmful to both myself and the folks that I'm having conversations with because I'm not actually able to be fully present. So I think that's the one I'll offer. Yeah.
Appreciate that. I'd like to share something that I've experienced in conversations about race that I've been engaged in. Uh, there still is a lack of acknowledgement that race itself is an issue in a lot of things that are happening. A lot of conversations I find myself in, people are like, well, that's not because the person was Black or because this, it must have been because of something else. And, even if it's a situation that I'm describing that I experienced, and, it's the funny thing about racism and racial acts is that it's not explicit. Like, no one ever tells me, Chris, I crossed the street because you're Black. Like, no one ever says, Chris, you didn't get the job because you're Black. Right. And so as a Black person, I'm always engaged in that thought process in my mind. Like, is this because I'm Black? Now I've resigned to the fact that more often than not, it probably is. Like, that's just my own personal bias or my own experience. Right. But when I'm expressing something to someone else, they're always trying to find the other reason why it is not that fact that I'm Black. So that lack of acknowledgement is a barrier. It's upsetting and frustrating to me as someone trying to engage in a conversation. It makes me tap out, honestly, sometimes. Something else that has come forward is this idea of exceptionalism, because I've achieved certain levels and I have certain privileges and I've done certain things. Oh, you could have never experienced racism, or just because you did it, someone else should be able to do it. And I have had privileges and opportunities that have allowed me to get to certain places that other Black folks, other Black men, other Black boys from Brooklyn have not experienced. Right. And so I may be exceptional, and I put that in quotes, but it's really just the opportunities that I've had. And the last thing tied into privileges, when I'm in conversations about race internally with other Black folks, sometimes my privilege does prevent me from fully engaging in a conversation and understanding their point of view. And I'm a Black man, and so there are different things that I experience as opposed to my wife who's a Black woman. And sometimes it's hard for me to understand things that she's experienced and really engage in a conversation with her because I'm sitting on my privilege. And I'm like, nah, that could never happen. So the same thing that happens to me externally with white folks or other people, I find myself doing internally with conversations with other Black folks. So it's something that I'm trying to be more aware of, and, understanding how my privilege is painting even my conversations internally with Black folks about race. So yeah, those what I'll offer.
I want to piggyback on that. Thank you, Chris, and Krista. I totally agree with what you were saying, Chris. Because I think Dana used to call it colonizing my experience when people tell you you couldn't have experienced that and you lived it, right? I have trouble with that. I have also, one of the barriers I find is when I'm even amongst friends, and I'm usually very, very careful with whom I have conversations about religion, race, politics, money. It's very Southern in that way. And even within those safe spaces, I find myself tailoring my thoughts, and it's very frustrating for me, tailoring my wording in a way that keeps people at ease or keeps them in a space where they're open to hearing me because of my largeness and my skin tone and my very sort of strong opinion, my big operatic voice and resonant speaking voice, I can be seen as an aggressor. And so then people shut down, and then my experiences are not valid, or that's the reason why I experienced that, because maybe I'm being perceived as aggressive, maybe you are aggressive. And so we can never, sometimes it's a barrier to getting to the point, and for them to see my full humanity. And I also think within within the Black community, to your point, my queerness is a thing that is a challenge for me, because even within, as you said, your wife has experiences as a Black woman you would not have had. There are experiences I find that I have had as a Black queer male within the Black community that have reduced my humanity below that of Black women. And that's challenging to sometimes have those conversations in which if I'm wanting to be honest, how I feel that Black females have been complicit in the disenfranchisement of Black queers within the Black community, and how Black cis hetero men are oftentimes privileged as the white man in our community, and how our experiences are different. So that's a barrier when talking about race.
I so many beautiful points, and I love how you make that last statement. I'm talking about race, but it's all about race, right? It's so much intersectionality of it. We're talking about our ego, we're talking about gender, we're talking about class, we're talking about privilege. There's so many aspects, body size and queer identity. There's so many components. And I think, to Chris's point, my default is like, it is about race. And I have found when people raise that question, or, well, how do you know it's about race, and they're gaslighting and trying to colonize your experience, I often find myself saying, but what if it was, right? Like, okay, let's say you're saying it wasn't. We can answer that question, but can we please engage with, what if it was about race? What if it was? What would that mean? And I think for a lot of people, that's a moral injury. It's painful to even imagine that these things do lead to limitations of resources and access to resources. I have 7 other card questions, and I'm very cognizant of the idea. I'm going to be bold and try and get 2 more questions in. I'm going to shift to the reduction section, although I have 2 more really good investigation questions, but I want to make sure we're centering it on our young people. And so, share a belief you held about race that you do not want to pass on to the next generation.
I can start. I think when I think about the explicit and the not explicit things that were shared with me or instilled in me as I was growing up around race, I think one thing that was very clear is that, regardless of how you're interacting with somebody, or regardless of what your experience is with that person, that race is a difference, and that recognizing that difference and making that something that makes the person that you're interacting with an other to you is something that it wasn't directly taught to me, but it was, I think there are, 2 sides to being aware of race, right? And so, or many sides to being aware of race. But one thing that, when I was growing up in the Midwest, it was very much that, that is a different group, which my parents and family didn't say that meant them bad or necessarily there was something wrong, but like, that's not who we are. We're part of different groups, right? And I think that what I would like to see not carried on is that the conversation stops there, that there's difference, right? But that there are more conversations around like the beauty that can be in that difference and the challenges that are inherent in those differences, and like the spectrum of what that difference brings to the table in terms of just living in this world. And I think that so I think the aspect that I would like to see not continue on is just leaving things unsaid, which is funny given what I said just a moment ago in the past question. So I guess I'm telling myself that as well, not leaving those things unsaid. I would like that to be what goes moving forward.
I would agree with that. One, I mean, I have 2 came to mind. One is that race is something you don't talk about. I mean, I think I learned that, but you don't name it, you don't talk about it. It is very important, and yet simultaneously nothing to talk about. like I think that's something I'm really trying not to pass on. And then the other one is that racism is evil. And if you're racist, you're just a bad person, end of story, get away. As opposed to this idea that racism is, as you've said many times, Dana, a social disease. And that it's in some ways, especially in this country, in the air that we breathe. And how could we not all have breathed in some particles of something? And I think they're related, that it's easier to talk about if it's not demonized. I think in some ways, not only, hearing what you said, Krista, about other, racist was also other. Racist was the Ku Klux Klan. Racist was the slave owners, and it was very easy to other them and other, and we were off the hook. Racism is everywhere. It is something that we have to talk about, and we have to own, and we have to name in ourselves and our own biases and our own stuff. And I'd like for that to shift with the next generation.
Something that I appreciate the responses and appreciate being in the room with you all. Incredible. Something that I've been thinking about that I was not all the way conscious of that happened with me is that I bought into the fact that I had to minimize myself in certain areas because I was Black, because I was a little Black boy, right? And so something that I want, something that I don't want that to continue with the younger generation. I want everyone to have the opportunity to be their full self as early as possible, right? And to continue being that full self. And so it took me a long time to be unapologetically Black, right? And now that's how I maneuver. It is what it is, but I wasn't always that way. And so, with my son and all the young people that I interact with, I'm making sure that I'm not actively stunting them and minimizing them and using minimizing language, right? Or telling them that they shouldn't do certain things. Obviously teaching them about situational awareness is important. And, just because you can do something doesn't mean you always should do it, but never saying, hey, don't do this. When you're in these spaces, make sure you do X, Y, and Z, but engaging in conversation about, hey, it's okay to be your full self, right? It's okay to walk around in the waiting room. You can't get in someone's face and you can't touch somebody else, right? But I'm not going to have you sit down because of the perception that people have of Black kids. Fine, you can walk around, that's fine. Just don't touch anybody, right? Don't invade someone's private space. Ask someone before you engage with them. Like, work on those things, So that's something I'm actively working on with young people, my own and the ones I encounter.
So I want to respond, but I'm going to hold it because we're going to have some time for everyone else who is joining us to ask questions or to comment. So I'll end with my favorite race cards question, which is my biggest takeaway from engaging in racial awareness conversations for everyone has been. So what are you taking away from this conversation today?
I'm taking away that more of these conversations need to happen, and that I want to stay on here for another hour and talk with all of y'all and talk with everyone who's watching and have more conversations. So that's my takeaway.
My takeaway, I think, is, well, just joy in that these conversations are being had, and that there are different perspectives provided and offered here from uniquely different human beings who have an earnest desire to, unpack and find ways to move forward, and that we are actively listening, and there are safe spaces to offer, candid, real, opinions, and that the vulnerability is being honored. And hopefully that this is providing, space for larger groups of people to have these sort of conversations. Brava for the race cards. They're fantastic.
Yeah, brava for the race cards is definitely one of mine. Also, keep hanging out with Dana because she knows the coolest people. But I echo what you said, Brian, about vulnerability being an honor. And I would say I would concur with everything that's been said, and also that healing is possible, even if person to person in kind of micro slivers of ways. That that's something. That's not nothing.
Real quickly, I'm appreciative uh, that so much thought and effort has been put into this, to developing these cards and engaging in these types of conversations. I mean, like I said, historically, it's been very frustrating and deflating, and oftentimes I don't want to engage. So I feel appreciative to have been a part of this one, and also encourage that we can engage. I can get back into engaging these conversations in a way that could be helpful and supportive and lead to some change. So I'm appreciative of Dana for creating the cards and everyone who worked on them and supported her in that process and being part of this conversation today.
Well, I have to say, this is the first time I've done the cards this way as a panel. And I'm so inspired. And my biggest takeaway is that so much bravery. Like I'm trying to hold back tears at how beautiful you all are. So thank you for saying thank you for being, thank you for saying yes for being on this panel today. And so we're going to open it up for the community. Elijah, do you have questions for us?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dana, and thank you to our panel. There's three things that are going to be in the chat momentarily for our live audience. If you are enjoying these race cards in the demonstration, please access one of the links in the chat. You'll see there's a discount on the race cards. Click that. We have an evaluation that our panel and special guest Dr. Dana E. Crawford would like for us to fill out to show our participation and our support. That's also in the chat. And thirdly, you have an evaluation chat from the Learning Cafe and ECLC. We need your participation to continue to have conversations and to invite speakers and hold topics like this. We can't continue to do it without your support. So please click on those three links, just have them marinating in the back. I'm going to ask everyone to kind of multitask as I go through some of the questions that are coming from you. So we have three questions. I don't know how much time we'll have. I'll try to go through them quickly. Anyone in the panel can address them. The first one is, as a person of color, I struggle with some of my approaches to parenting my children. Am I doing more damage to my children by teaching them as if race doesn't exist, or by instructing them from my Black experience that might instill bias or fear in them?
Not sure if Elijah froze for anyone else, but Elijah froze for me. But I will say that racism is real. And so you could try to teach your child that something that is real doesn't exist. And I don't know how helpful that is. I've always, as a parent and as a pediatric psychologist, taken the rule that I don't ever want my child or any child that I care about to learn about something as big as this from someone that doesn't love them. And I remember a few months ago, I was listening to a podcast, and this woman shared, as a Black woman, she shared that the first time she ever heard of the N-word was when somebody called her that on a playground. And that will never be the experience of my children, is that the world will harm them to teach them. I will teach them with love about some of the most hideous things in the world. And I will say that although racism is hideous and scary, we teach our kids about horrible, scary things all the time. I wouldn't not teach my kid about kidnapping, right? Like I would want to protect them and have them have full knowledge of what they can do and where their power is. And so I will not say, if you're harming your child, how dare I as a parent, but I just invite a space of love. I don't know if the panelists have other thoughts on that.
I'm not a parent, but I would say it is a disservice to not teach your kids about racism, because, as Dana said, it does exist, and it affects not only them, but it also affects other people. And I've had, students. I teach for organizations, and sometimes I teach in classrooms, and I've had students refer to me as the N-word. And when I tell them not to use that word, they don't understand why they can't use that word. And these are children of color who are, children of immigrants, maybe like second or first generation. And then there are first generation Black kids who are, not African American, but from Africa or the Caribbean. And they understand what that word means. And so you have like Arab and Latino kids using this word, and they don't understand what it means, and they don't even know where it comes from. And they're like 10 years old and they've never heard of the civil rights movement. And so there's a lot being lost in terms of culture and history that that parents are not telling, and that we're not allowed to share in the school systems. But they are that makes them complicit in systemic racism. And if they are complicit, then how can they then call it out when they experience it? So I think it's important to definitely teach your kids about racism. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, panel. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I'm gonna keep the camera off and read some of the other questions. The second question that we have says, the second race card that was read seemed effective in having the players reflect and acknowledge biases that they hold. What do each of you do from day to day to minimize how much your acknowledged bias impacts your worldview?
I don't think I've been fully answered that second question. I do want to say I understand why you might experience that. What I wanted to, and I was talking too much, what I wanted to say at the very end there is that I did, during the George Floyd situation, develop biases against Latin police people, because I felt betrayed and I felt shocked by the racism that I was experiencing, and because I had only really thought I experienced that from white people. And when I saw the footage in New York, that rocked my world, and I had to work through that, and I still have to work through that, because I began to see, whereas I assumed there was a connection there and a safety, I began to view Latino police officers in New York City in the same way I viewed white police officers anywhere else. And I didn't feel safe around them. And I've had interactions with Latino police officers that have changed that, changed my mind about that. Who've actually, had my back in situations. But I had to work with that for a while. So I hope that answers the question.
I would just, I'm sorry. I was just going to say that I try to remember that it's not my first thought isn't necessarily who I am or isn't my true thought. It's what I do when I recognize that thought, and then what is my second thought, right? Like, do I question it? Do I think about it? Do I engage with it? Why did I have that reaction, or why did I feel that way at the first moment? And then, how do I really want to show up? And again, trying not to work focus too much on the fact that I had a thought that doesn't align with who I want to show up as in the world, but really think about, okay, why did that happen, and how can I move from that? That's how I try to do it on a day-to-day basis.
I think that's exactly right. It's just saying like, oh, that was biased. Like, oh, that was a biased thought, naming it. It's almost like I talk to parents about kids' tantrums, name it to tame it. It's the same idea. And then really being mindful not to go down that shame spiral, that this means I'm an evil, horrible person, which is another bias that we, and again, and I think just engaging with this work in a really active way, doing the CBRT work, CRBT work, and you know, having it's a lens, right? It's a lens. If I'm going through the day looking for biases that I have without judging myself too harshly for them, then it's practice. It's a muscle. It's noticing them. And then, as you said, Krista, challenge, then it's sort of like, well, what's my actual thought? Okay, I'm going to practice. That's a neuron, that's neurons in my brain.
Thank you so much for all of your insights, your experiences, and your takes on these questions, and just giving us that demonstration to show us that these kinds of conversations don't have to be these taboo things that we can't engage in our own way. So hopefully, I hope all of our live audience joining are interested in getting these cards, holding these conversations, and once again, joining us in a Learning Cafe space. Thank you for our time together, and please express your thanks, and I want to express my thanks to this beautiful panel. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Chris, Krista, and Rebecca. For all attending, please have a most wonderful day.